Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of our political podcast. Today is a very special day because it's the day after my dad's birthday. Happy birthday, Dad.
Thank you.
The reason he sounds the way that he does, or the reason why he might be a little slow to wake up, is because he went out partying last night. So he's probably a little hungover, but that's okay. You get to do that when you have a birthday.
She's exaggerating.
I don't think I am.
I know you are.
So with that being said, now let's talk about today's topic, which will be the Texas infrastructure, specifically the electricity grid. And now the reason, or the prompt, or what prompted me to choose this as today's topic is we already passed the expectations for the power grid for the summer. Now, I'm sure a lot of people experienced the 2021 Texas freeze that happened on Valentine's Day, that snowstorm, and the weeks after, the days after, having experienced some sort of power failure or not having any power. And I didn't live through that. And I don't want to live through something like that in the hot summer or in the cold winter. I just don't. So when I saw that that the demand for electricity on the Texas power grid has already surpassed the projected peak for the season, I was a little concerned. Peak demand hit 77,460 megawatts on Tuesday afternoon. Actually, no, not Tuesday afternoon. This was 2-3 weeks ago, I believe. And the projected peak was 77,317, which was supposed to be projected on August 10th. So the fact that we were literally just within 100 megawatts of the projected peak, and it already happened before it was supposed to happen, kind of scares me. And megawatts, I mean, I saw something that said that about 200 megawatts, 1 megawatt of electricity is enough to power about 200 homes. And again, peak demand is at about 77,000 megawatts. So 77,000 times 200 is about the estimate, or is about the idea of what I can give you what a megawatt of electricity is. Okay, with that being said, my dad, who lived through the Texas freeze, can give some insights, and I'm sure we don't need enough of that, or a lot of that, because of I'm sure a lot of you did live through that. But there was another event that happened 10 years ago.
Yes.
So can you tell us about what that event was? And let's talk about ERCOT, and let's talk about some of the issues with our electricity grid.
The reason the event 10 years ago was important, it's called the ground. This one was Valentine's Day in 21. It was the Groundhog's Day event in 2011. There was, same thing, 4 million homes approximately lost power. And afterwards, there was a lot of talk about what we're going to do to improve so this doesn't happen again. Well, everybody talked. 10 years later, nothing was done, and it got even more dire in 21 than it did in 2011, because the extension of cold lasted a week instead of 3 or 4 days, and it was really cold in 21. What was important about 2011 was, okay, it happened, what are we going to do? And then nothing. We got stuck with inaction. And this is a concern, and this is one reason why Victoria is concerned about this. What are we going to do going forward? How do we meet this? Now, she talked about the usage in summer versus the usage in winter. It's a little different in Texas because we're used to using we're used to using a great bit of electricity in summer. The heat's pretty normal for us. We start getting into the 90s in May, and the 90s can last sometimes as long as October. That's a little, not always October, but it can get into that. And so, the electric companies, what we call ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, plans for this. And they plan for how to manage the electrical use or the distribution of electricity during these events. And they tried planning for 2011, 2021, but it's a different scenario because in the winter, these the freezing temperature causes even more than just strain on the electrical grid. It causes damage. There are facilities that when it gets that cold, they just broke, to put it simply. And so whatever they could do, it couldn't be done. Then you have a system that's overloaded that can't manage, and one part of ERCOT is to manage the ebb and flow of the electricity, make sure that we don't get to these points. And this, I don't get into a lot of technicalities, but if you start reaching certain demands, it puts a strain on the system, and the system shuts down on its own. Or I'm not 100% sure of that, but there are trips and breakers in there that keep from the system from being overloaded so that those individual components don't get damaged. So in the winter, when you have the possibility of that, plus the fuel source, natural gas, they had problems with getting natural gas to people because the roads were frozen. They had trouble with natural gas because the power plants that use natural gas, they froze. Some of their components froze, and they could not even produce electricity. That's different than the summer. The summer peak usage, we're not worried about freezing weather. We're not worried about not being able to get, fuel to the power plants because of ice on the roads and all those other things. Yet, we're looking at a summer that's going to be pretty hot. When she mentioned that power outage, that was June. We don't usually start getting multiple 100-degree days until late July and August. So if we're reaching peak capacity in June, that makes the normal times of our heat quite scary. I mean, it's July 9th, it's 95 degrees before 11 o'clock in the morning. That's going to put a strain on the system.
Mm-hmm. And so ERCOT itself, it's been around since the 1970s. And
Yes.
one of the reasons that we weren't able to get help is because Texas has its own power grid. And so when it's its own power grid, we couldn't use power or get help from the other two major power grids within the United States. So basically, there's only 3 power grids. And so when all the issues happened in February of 2021, we only had ourselves and the operators and the board, ERCOT. We only could rely on what they could do. We couldn't rely on what the entire United States could do. We could not we couldn't ask for help from other operators or anything like that. So which I found interesting because ERCOT, the reason it was founded, it was founded in the 1970s when there was also issues with like rolling blackouts. And it's a nonprofit corporation, and it's made up of, I believe, the operators and consumers, electric cooperatives, power marketers, retail electric providers, and investor-owned electric utilities. So it's if it's saying the consumer, we're part of ERCOT. Are we part of this nonprofit? Sorry, this is probably a little off rails, but I'm confused on what its members include consumers.
Basically, there are board members that represent each of the groups you mentioned.
Okay.
So that's how those people represented it. So you have somebody on the board that says, my task is to protect these interests,
Mm-hmm.
and of the list you mentioned.
And ERCOT hasn't really made any changes or updates, really, over the course of the past few years since the other freeze event, the one that happened in 2011 and the one that happened in 2021. There hasn't been any sort of major changes to what's been happening because they've been asking for more money to keep the power grids online to meet the increased demands from people across Texas.
The power grid's old in Texas, and there's no way to completely overhaul it without spending an enormous amount of money. And of course, you talk about spending an enormous amount of money. It comes mainly from 2 people, the people who pay the rates and the taxpayers. And so that doesn't go well with the populace to foot this bill. But then again, let's talk about why that may be important. And I think there needs to be, a comprehensive look at how we're going to refinance rebuilding the electrical grid. It's old. It needs more than repair. I mean, we're in the 21st century, and Texas is growing. You look at the cities, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, they're going to be using more and more electricity. Around the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there are 9 counties that are just exploding in growth. And so we're going to need more electricity. And relying on the same system we relied on since the 70s, sooner or later, this isn't going to work. It's going to break, and it's going to break ugly. Or that's a possibility. Can't say that will happen.
Well, yeah, but then they're also talking about if there is some sort of all-out blackout, it's going to take a month or 2 months to slowly get everything running, because once the system, the grid shuts down, then that means the equipment itself has broken, and then once it's completely offline, off grid, they're going to have to go through inspections, make repairs, and test it out before they can even bring it back online. So if something happens where there's another major storm, or there's another issue with, or if we consume too much, demand too much on the grid, once it breaks out, it's going to take a month or 2 months for people to get electricity back. And we use electricity in everything. Like the point you were making earlier, we have heat, we have AC, we have lights, we have computers, we have a bunch of different ways that we use electricity.
Yeah, everybody knows electric is part of our lives. You walk into your house and there's 10 things going right when you walk in the door. Mm-hmm. And so then you start turning on lights. Then you turn the air conditioner down a little bit more because, you may have said, well, I'm not going to be home. I'm going to turn it up a couple degrees. Well, now you turn it back down. And this is happening across the board throughout, all the communities here in Texas. And if we have no backup, like Vicki was saying, we're in our own electric grid. We can't connect into and get help from other, from the larger national grids, the eastern side and the western side. Then once it goes down here, it goes down. Mm-hmm. And there's no going back, like you were saying. The specific event Victoria was talking about was the 2021 storm, where they say we were within about 4 minutes of completely losing power in Texas. Mm-hmm. Which, when you think 4 minutes, okay, I don't think that's going to happen this summer. The summer, like I said, they're a little bit better prepared to run and manage summer, because that's normal around here. Even a hotter than normal summer is still something that can be managed. The concern is, as we continue to grow more and more people, we're going to need to rebuild, not repair, because repair is ad hoc and it's this place and that place. It doesn't really get electricity for this growth. We're going to need to rebuild this electric grid, and that's going to entail a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So we need to start looking at this, because what we did in 2011, nothing. It's only going to get worse, because this grid is getting older. That was 10 years ago. Then we had 21. And then, okay, it took 10 years between two winter storms. What's the big deal? I've actually heard people say that. The big deal is it still goes year-round, and the more we add to it, the more strain we're adding to the system. And sooner or later, that will show. So what do we do going forward? We didn't do anything from 2011. We had a bunch of proposals in 21. We've made minor adjustments to those proposals, but down the road, we're going to need some big picture stuff.
Right. And then one of the big picture stuff that was supposed to come in was supposed to be this infrastructure bill from the federal government. It passed last year, and it was part of Biden's Build Back Better, that campaign bill, not campaign, but it was part of that bill that passed that was supposed to send billions of dollars across the United States for infrastructure. Texas was supposed to get 36 million of that. Billion of that. So I guess it was it was like a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Anyways, Texas was supposed to get $36 billion of that. We haven't really seen a lot of that come in, mostly because I believe Texas Republic. There's been issues coming to an agreement with creating a budget.
Right. Now let's back up. Funding this bill, the bill passed. Mm-hmm. Funding it requires that the United States government passes a budget. They haven't passed a budget in the last year or so. So they're basically running on, well, we'll pass enough, they're called continuing resolutions, to get us through for the next 90 days or whatever the time frame of the continuing resolution is, so we can work out the budget. Well, they've done 3 in the last year or so, or even less than a year. So that's one issue. And then most of the money Texas is going to get from this infrastructure project will go to what people think, roads, things they see. You don't see electricity. The grid is all wired into your house, and you see the electrical lines going across the street or something like that. But the roads and things like that is where most of the money is coming from. Biden did try to give some of the money to broadband and things like that. But there isn't a lot of money for electricity because the rest of the country has the two larger grids. They're interconnected. They can rely on each other, and they have a little bit more flexibility. Texas is a standalone. This money has to come someplace else, and it's not really going to come a lot from the federal government at this point.
So it's going to come from people, taxpayers, and from people.
Ratepayers.
Yeah, ratepayers. But then again, is the tax money that'll go to, it's going to maintaining this grid. There's not really anything to rebuilding the infrastructure for this grid, which is just another frustration because we're spending money on something that's going to end up needing to be replaced in the first place. And it shows, I don't want to say the incompetency of government, but it shows kind of like how government has like a short memory.
Short attention span.
Short attention span, because really what's happening are things just to a lot of things that happen is bills are passed and resolutions are passed that are short term, like nothing for the long term, because people are trying to get reelected or they're trying to abate. I don't know if that's a word, but like trying to calm down inflammatory issues for the short term. And there's really no long-term planning for, okay, I'm going to be in office for 4 years. Maybe I'll be in office for 8 years, but let's see what, 10 years down the line, whatever we're doing today is going to affect what's going to happen 10 years down the line. And I may not be in office, but I still need to make sure that this is being taken care of or looked over, or I need to do stuff today that will make sure that people 10 years from now, even though they're not my constituents, are still using a reliable electricity grid. And although right now, reading what ERCOT has to say, they say that they can sustain up to 91,000 megawatts this summer and that they're better prepared. But again, to your point, it's just a matter of time for when everything will fail because the grid is old. And I haven't seen any sort of, when we're doing research on this, I haven't seen much reporting or any research on the investment that's going to happen for a new grid. I've seen, in fact, what I've seen are ERCOT's asking for deferments for maintenance so that they can keep the grid online. Those deferments can only go so long. It says, this is according to the Austin Statesman, I believe that's the name of the...
Austin American Statesman.
Yeah, Austin American, Statesman, where it says the grid's performance has backed up, according to this article, the claims that they're going to be able to meet all the demand, that they're not going to have to go online. So that's what ERCOT's saying, is that the grid's performance has backed them up, handling the enormous power demand in recent weeks without major hitches, aside from some requests by ERCOT for power generators to defer maintenance and stay online. Again, it's just there's no long-term solutions being laid out here.
And there's two parts to this. There's electricity. There's fuel for the electricity. So you'll hear Texas has natural gas plants. They have a little bit of nuclear still. There's the growth of the wind and the solar. And all these have their pros and cons, which source can supply electricity. That's part of it. That's the fuel that creates electricity. Electricity then has a problem because you can't store it. Everybody talks about, electric vehicles and, the batteries for electric vehicles. That exists across electricity. There's not major batteries where you can store, 10,000 megawatts to turn on, when peak demand hits. So there's a big supply and demand, and it's immediate balance. And that's one of the things ERCOT manages, is that supply and demand. There's the fuel needs to get to the power plants. The power plants then produce it, and then they push it out to us, the homeowners and the businesses and things like that. So when we talk about the grid, that's where the electricity flows through to get to our homes. But there's a whole bunch of things involved that get us there. So we not only need to worry about the grid, we need to make sure we have powers, the fuel, to keep, to be available during high demand. And that was, one of the problems with the freeze. Natural gas was freezing. Oh, well, not natural gas itself, but the components that, there's water vapor and gas, and it causes things to happen to the power plants and getting it to in production. So ERCOT does balance all this out, but they can only do so much if we, meaning across the board, businesses, government, and consumers don't get together and figure out what we need to do to make sure that we have the demand, or we have the capacity to meet the demand going forward. So you have the grid, and that's when we talk about, kind of as an infrastructure project. That's the physical wires and facilities to get it out to us. There's the fuel. So all this has to be balanced by ERCOT, but there's two components that we always have to consider. Do we have both in play at all times? And that's one thing we have to look at when we do rebuild the grid.
And going more onto that point, so we've been talking about ERCOT, but then above ERCOT is the Public Utility Commission of Texas. So the people that are so ERCOT, they are overseen by the Public Utility Commission of Texas, so PUC, and the Texas legislator. So they're kind of like second. They're just being told what to do essentially, and then they can make some decisions based on the outage, or not the outage, but
they're day-to-day operations.
There we go, day-to-day operations. And then the Public Utility Commission of Texas, who oversees ERCOT, their board of directors, which I believe, not board of directors, so they're made up of commissioners and a chair. And those commissioners and the chair are appointed by the governor of Texas. So the governor of Texas appoints PUC commissioners who oversee the ERCOT, which is in charge of day-to-day operations. ERCOT is governed by a board of directors made up of independent members, consumers, and representatives. And then during the 2021 freeze is when they realized that a third of ERCOT, of its board members, didn't even live in Texas. So that was kind of one of the major... So when a lot of things can go by, like a lot of things will be not, I don't want to say let go of, but are overseen, but a lot of issues, often you can see them in advance if you're really paying close attention. But if there's no issues and things are just going okay, then people are not going to be aware of some of the things happening within government. I'm specifically talking about politics and government, but you can really apply this to any issue in life. So, but when, bad word hits the fan, that's when everyone will take out their magnifying glass and really look in and see where the issues are. And when they see those issues, they could have seen how they could have been prevented. This is one of those instances where the members who were living out of state shouldn't have been members of this board if they weren't even citizens of Texas. That's in my opinion, because this is a Texas issue. This grid is specifically for Texas. I don't understand why we had people from out of state trying to oversee what was happening within the Texas grid.
I think it goes back to your earlier point of everything is immediate gratification. I know you didn't use those terms, but in politics, we just do things to pass bills and things like that for what's, the problem of the day. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard to get the political energy to plan 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road. We've done it. We can do it. We did create ERCOT in the first place to kind of deal with this and build our own power structure and separate ourselves from the United States grid because, we weren't happy with what was going on in the 70s. So we're able, but it's getting that political will to come up and say, okay, these are the new issues. We did this. That's done. Time to move forward. And change has to happen. And getting the political will is hard in today's environment. I mean, everything is real, social media, it's instantaneous. You have to have a reaction instantaneously. But that doesn't get anything done. And these are the kind of issues that, when it comes to our politics, we need people to get in there and say, this is an issue. This should be a primary focus type issue. And the political will isn't there right now. And until we have that, this is going to hang over our heads, and we're going to have more and more, crisis situations until maybe we have enough that people either force the issue or Texas has other real problems.
And this is another point that I came across when we were researching this, but the Texas grid is not subject to federal regulation. So
that's the point of us being separate. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to be part of federal regulation because in the 70s, when this was all developed, or our electric grid was developed, those blackouts were national and they affected Texas. And they said, "Hey, step back. We don't want your problems." And
Mm-hmm.
they're talking about the blackouts in the 70s. Again, the political will was there at that time. Where is it now?
Mm-hmm. So that was something else that was kind of interesting. But I believe this deregulation actually increased residential electricity rates. At least when I'm looking at a report, I was looking at a report that prior to deregulation, residential electricity rates were significantly below the national average. After deregulation, residential electricity rates increased, rising 64% between 1999 and 2007. So it was only during that point in time, but still, it comes to this is something I've always contended with, as in political philosophy, but federal regulation versus state legislation, regulation or legislation.
Well, you're getting into some apples and oranges here. The deregulation was on rates themselves. Mm-hmm. In other words, they said the market will give the consumer the best rate. That's what deregulation is supposed to do. And it could, but to your point, from 99 to 2007, it didn't. But that's the whole point of deregulation, is to put market forces in play versus the government determining what the cost of, essentially the cost of goods are, in this case, electricity. And that's another big political argument we have in this country. So we'll step back from that, because that's not really what we're looking at in regards to how do we pay for what's going forward.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, I do want to wrap it up, because there's really no long-term solution in place other than, deferring until they can, so that they can keep electricity on, and then maintenance just throughout, every couple months, every couple years, or when it's needed with this electricity grid. And this is actually something terrifying me. It's probably why I'm going to move to Portugal. I think that's at least where my dad's wanting to move, is Portugal. I think I want to move, I don't know, somewhere with a little bit more economic stability. Although Portugal they're not as bad, but they were hit hard in the mid 2000s. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of our podcast. I don't know if there were any closing remarks that you wanted to make.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you throwing me under the bus at the beginning of this podcast.
Happy birthday.
It wasn't that bad. Come on. And this is something we'll probably revisit. Victoria came to me, and she's a young person. This is one of those generational things you hear about in politics. What are we going to do for the next generation? And this is one of the issues that I think Victoria's group needs to jump on, because this will affect the quality of their life going forward.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and we will talk to you next time.